For many actors, fame becomes the goal. For Phoebe Cates, it became a question. In the early 1980s, she quickly became one of the most recognizable faces of a generation. A single moment on screen helped define youth culture and placed her firmly inside Hollywood's spotlight. But the deeper story of her career is not about sudden success. It's about the tension between public fame and personal identity. Like many professionals who spend decades building a career, there comes a moment when recognition brings a different kind of pressure. The expectations grow, the image hardens, and the choices become more complicated. Phoebe Cates eventually faced that same crossroads. Her response would quietly challenge what success in Hollywood was supposed to look like. So let's take a closer look at the story and what it reveals about identity, control, and the meaning of success. Phoebe Cates' breakthrough arrived at a moment when Hollywood itself was undergoing a transformation. In the early 1980s, the film industry was increasingly focused on youth-oriented stories. Studios had begun to recognize the economic power of teenage and young adult audiences, and a wave of films centered on high school life, adolescence, and coming-of-age experiences quickly reshaped the cultural landscape of American cinema. These movies were not simply entertainment, they became cultural reference points for an entire generation. It was within this environment that Fast Times at Ridgemont High emerged in 1982. The film captured the messy, awkward, and often humorous reality of teenage life with a level of authenticity that stood out at the time. Unlike earlier studio portrayals of adolescence, it allowed characters to feel imperfect and recognizable. Audiences responded immediately, and the film soon became one of the defining youth movies of the decade. For Phoebe Cates, the film represented far more than just another acting role. Her performance placed her directly at the center of the cultural moment Hollywood was trying to capture. In a matter of months, her visibility expanded dramatically. Suddenly, she was not simply an actress appearing in a successful film. She had become part of a broader cultural image tied to the identity of the 1980s itself. In Hollywood, moments like this rarely arrive gradually. They appear suddenly, and they reshape a career almost overnight. One brief scene in the film would become particularly memorable to audiences. It circulated widely in the cultural imagination of the time, replayed in discussions about youth culture, cinema, and the changing tone of American movies in the 1980s. For many viewers, that image became inseparable from Cates' name. And with that visibility came a powerful shift. This was the moment success stopped being opportunity and started becoming expectation. Before that moment, Phoebe Cates had been another young performer trying to find her place in the industry. After it, she carried the weight of a public image that Hollywood and audiences expected her to continue embodying. The entertainment industry has always been skilled at turning moments into identities. When a performance resonates strongly with audiences, studios often attempt to repeat the formula. Casting decisions begin to follow familiar patterns. Roles start to echo the image that first brought recognition. For many actors, this process can quietly narrow the range of choices available to them. What made Cates' situation particularly interesting was how quickly this identity formed. In an industry known for gradual career development, her rise into public recognition happened with remarkable speed. Suddenly, she was not simply a performer within the film. She had become one of the faces associated with an entire cinematic era. For viewers who built their own careers during the same decades, this turning point may feel surprisingly familiar. In many professions, a breakthrough moment, whether a promotion, a successful project, or a public achievement, can reshape how colleagues and industries perceive someone. The recognition feels validating, but it also carries a quiet shift in expectations. From that point forward, people begin to assume continuity. The breakthrough that once created opportunity begins to create pressure. For Phoebe Cates, the years that followed would reveal just how complex that transition could become. Hollywood had discovered a new star, but the real challenge would be determining what kind of career could exist beyond the image that made her famous. And that next stage of her story would reveal the hidden pressures that often follow success. So let's continue the story. The success of Fast Times at Ridgemont High did more than elevate Phoebe Cates' visibility. It quietly reshaped the way audiences, studios, and the media perceived her. Almost overnight, she was no longer simply an emerging actress navigating early opportunities. She had become an image, one that represented a very specific moment in American pop culture. In Hollywood, that shift can happen quickly. A breakthrough performance does not just open doors, it creates a public narrative around who an actor is supposed to be. For Cates, the recognition that followed her breakout role carried a powerful expectation. Audiences remembered the moment that introduced her to the world, and the industry began to view her through that same lens. Public perception tends to simplify complex careers. Instead of seeing a performer exploring different roles, the public often remembers the single image that first captured their attention. In Cates's case, that image became closely tied to the youthful, carefree spirit that defined much of 1980s cinema. It was flattering, but it was also limiting. Many Americans who built long careers understand that success can sometimes create its own form of pressure. When one achievement becomes widely recognized, colleagues and institutions may begin to assume that it defines the rest of your professional identity. The accomplishment that once felt like progress slowly becomes a standard you are expected to maintain. In the entertainment industry, this pressure is intensified by the way visibility shapes opportunity. Casting directors, producers, and studios often search for familiarity when making decisions. If an audience strongly associates an actor with a particular image, the industry may hesitate to place them in roles that challenge that perception. For Cates, this meant navigating a professional environment where recognition came with a clear set of expectations. Hollywood's system at the time frequently placed young actresses into narrow categories built around appearance, youth, and immediate audience appeal. Once those categories were established, it could be difficult to move beyond them. Many Americans who built long careers understand how a reputation can become both an asset and a constraint. Over decades of work, professionals often discover that the very strengths that help them succeed early on can later define how others see their abilities. Expanding beyond that perception requires careful choices and patience. For someone in Cates's position, the challenge was not simply about choosing the next role. It was about managing the gap between how the public saw her and how she may have wanted to shape her own creative direction. Fame tends to amplify that gap. The larger the audience, the stronger the expectations become. At the same time, the cultural moment of the 1980s added another layer of complexity. Youth-oriented films were becoming major commercial successes, and the industry had strong incentives to repeat formulas that worked. Actors who had become part of that formula were often encouraged to remain within it. This is one of the hidden dynamics of fame. Recognition can transform professional identity faster than a career can naturally evolve. The person behind the success may still be discovering their interests and ambitions, while the public has already decided who they are. For viewers who have spent decades building careers of their own, this dynamic may feel strikingly familiar. Over time, responsibility grows, expectations deepen, and the freedom to experiment sometimes narrows. Success brings validation, but it also brings the quiet pressure to remain consistent with what others expect. Phoebe Cates now faced that same reality. Hollywood had helped create an image that audiences embraced, but the question of how she would respond to those expectations was only beginning to unfold. And that response would reveal an important shift in how she approached the direction of her career. Let's continue the story. As the expectations surrounding Phoebe Cates continued to grow, the next phase of her career required a different kind of decision-making. The challenge was no longer about gaining recognition. It was about maintaining control over how that recognition would shape the rest of her professional life. In Hollywood, early success often encourages actors to repeat what worked before. Studios look for familiar formulas, audiences respond to recognizable images, and careers can easily follow a predictable pattern. For many performers, that momentum becomes difficult to step away from. Yet Cates's career during the mid-1980s and early 1990s suggests a more deliberate approach. Rather than chasing constant visibility, she appeared to make choices that preserved a sense of autonomy over her work. While she continued appearing in films, she also explored creative spaces that offered different kinds of opportunities. Theater, for example, became an important outlet during this period. Stage work offered a kind of artistic environment very different from the commercial pressures of Hollywood films. The emphasis shifted from image to craft, from mass visibility to performance itself. This move did not reject the film industry entirely. Instead, it broadened the range of environments in which she could work. For actors, that kind of diversification can be a strategic decision. It allows a career to expand beyond a single identity while maintaining creative momentum. The importance of that adjustment becomes clearer when viewed within the broader structure of Hollywood at the time. During the 1980s, the industry often placed young actresses into highly specific categories tied to youth and appearance. These categories could bring rapid success, but they were rarely designed to support long-term evolution. Once an actor became associated with a particular image, studios often hesitated to challenge it. Cates's career choices during this period suggest an awareness of that dynamic. By working in environments like theater, where roles often demanded emotional range and interpretive depth, she positioned herself outside the narrow framework that film roles sometimes created. This allowed her professional identity to remain connected to performance rather than being limited solely to the image that had made her famous. Strategic repositioning in any career often requires stepping slightly outside the path that originally led to success. Many professionals discover that the early stage of their careers is defined by momentum, while the later stages depend more on deliberate choices. Long-term relevance rarely happens by accident, it emerges from a willingness to adjust direction when circumstances change. For Cates, that adjustment helped maintain balance between visibility and autonomy. She continued to appear in notable films during the decade, including projects that reinforced her connection to audiences who had first encountered her during the youth cinema boom of the early 1980s. At the same time, she was not solely dependent on repeating the same type of role. This dual approach is one of the quiet strategies that often sustain careers over time. By maintaining a presence in multiple creative environments, an actor can avoid being defined by a single moment or a single genre. Instead of allowing the industry to narrow the scope of their identity, they gradually expand it. In a broader sense, these decisions also reflected a deeper understanding of longevity. The entertainment industry frequently rewards immediate success, but sustaining relevance requires a longer perspective. Careers that endure are often shaped not by dramatic reinvention, but by thoughtful adjustments that preserve personal agency. Cates's approach during this period demonstrated how an actor could navigate fame without allowing it to dictate every professional decision. By protecting her sense of identity within the industry, she maintained the freedom to define what her career would look like beyond the expectations created by her breakthrough. And as the years progressed, those decisions would make it possible for her to take an even more significant step in redefining the relationship between success, work, and personal life. As Phoebe Cates moved beyond the most visible years of her film career, another shift began to take shape, one that reflected not only the realities of Hollywood but also the broader arc of a professional life. After navigating the early pressures of fame and strategically adjusting her creative direction, the next stage of her career became less about expansion and more about recalibration. In the entertainment industry, aging in the public eye has always carried unique challenges. The system that celebrates youthful discovery often struggles to accommodate the gradual evolution of its stars. Actors who first appear during periods of intense cultural visibility frequently discover that the industry expects them to remain frozen in that original image. For someone like Cates, whose public identity had been formed during the youth-oriented cinema boom of the 1980s, this expectation became especially pronounced. Yet the passage of time inevitably changes both audiences and performers. The viewers who once recognized Cates as part of a defining cinematic moment grew older themselves, building careers, families, and new priorities. As the cultural landscape shifted through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, the meaning of relevance also began to change. In this environment, recalibration often becomes a form of long-term strategy. Rather than pursuing visibility at any cost, many experienced professionals begin redefining what success actually looks like. In Hollywood, that might mean stepping away from the relentless cycle of production schedules and publicity. In other professions, it can mean shifting toward work that provides greater control over time, priorities, and creative direction. For Cates, This stage represented a quieter redefinition of professional identity. After years of navigating the expectations that followed her early fame, she gradually reduced her presence in the film industry. This was not a sudden disappearance or a dramatic turning point. Instead, it resembled the kind of transition many people experience after decades in demanding careers, an intentional shift toward a life that reflects personal values rather than external momentum. This recalibration also illustrates an important truth about longevity. Sustaining relevance over decades does not always require constant visibility. In fact, in some cases the opposite can be true. When public figures step away from the pressures of constant exposure, their earlier work can take on a different kind of cultural permanence. The films remain, the performances continue to circulate, and the public memory of that work becomes less tied to daily media attention. For audiences who first encountered Cates during the 1980s, her legacy gradually settled into that kind of enduring recognition. Her films became part of the cultural archive of that decade, revisited through television broadcasts, home video, and later digital platforms. The moments that defined her public image did not disappear simply because her on-screen appearances became less frequent. For viewers who have spent 20 or 30 years building careers of their own, this stage of life carries a familiar resonance. Over time, the definition of professional success often evolves. Early in a career, progress may be measured by recognition, advancement, or visibility. Later on, success is more often defined by stability, autonomy, and the freedom to shape one's own path. In that sense, Cates's recalibration reflects a broader human pattern rather than a uniquely Hollywood story. After experiencing the intensity of early fame and the expectations that followed it, she reached a point where continuing along the same trajectory no longer seemed necessary. The cultural image that had once defined her career remained intact, but it no longer dictated how she chose to live or work. This stage of her journey reveals something important about the long arc of professional life. Identity, especially in public careers, often evolves in stages. The early years establish recognition. The middle years demand strategic choices. And eventually, a quieter recalibration allows individuals to redefine success on their own terms. For Phoebe Cates, that recalibration did not erase the public image that first introduced her to audiences. Instead, it allowed that image to settle into history while her life continued to move forward beyond it. Looking back at Phoebe Cates's career today, what stands out most is not simply the fame she achieved, but the way she navigated it. Her story offers a quiet but powerful example of something many people spend decades learning. Success is not just about reaching the spotlight, it's about deciding what to do once you're there. In Hollywood, success often arrives quickly and loudly. Recognition can open doors, create opportunity, and validate years of effort. But it also introduces a new challenge: how to manage that success without allowing it to take control of your identity. For actors, the pressure can be especially intense. A single role, a memorable scene, or a moment of cultural attention can define how audiences see them for years. Phoebe Cates experienced that shift early in her career. Yet what makes her story interesting is not the fame itself, but how she approached it over time. Rather than allowing success to dictate every decision, she gradually reshaped her relationship with it. In doing so, she demonstrated that managing success sometimes means recognizing its limits. For viewers who have spent 20 or 30 years building their own careers, this idea may feel very familiar. Early achievements often create expectations from employers, colleagues, and even from ourselves. The world begins to assume that we will continue along the same path indefinitely. But long careers rarely unfold in straight lines. They evolve as priorities change, responsibilities grow, and personal values become clearer. That is where the second theme of Phoebe Cates's story becomes particularly meaningful: protecting personal autonomy. In many professions, autonomy becomes more valuable with time. The ability to decide where to invest your energy, what work truly matters, and how to balance professional life with personal priorities is something that often comes only after years of experience. Autonomy is rarely dramatic. It doesn't always involve bold public statements or sudden career shifts. More often, it appears through quieter decisions, choosing certain projects, declining others, or simply redefining what success means at a particular stage of life. Kate's career reflects that quieter form of autonomy. Her early success created a public identity that audiences strongly embraced. Yet she eventually demonstrated that identity does not have to remain fixed forever. Instead of continuing to chase the same level of visibility, she allowed her professional life to evolve in a way that aligned more closely with her long-term priorities. This leads to the final lesson her story offers, the idea of sustaining relevance over decades. In a culture that often celebrates constant visibility, it is easy to assume that relevance requires remaining in the public eye. But history suggests something different. Many figures remain culturally significant not because they appear everywhere, but because their work continues to resonate long after the initial moment of fame has passed. Phoebe Cates' films remain part of the cultural memory of the 1980s. For those who grew up during that era, her performances are tied to a specific moment in American cinema and personal memory. That connection has endured even as her public appearances have become rare. In a sense, her relevance has been sustained not by constant activity, but by the lasting impact of the work she chose to do. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson her story offers to viewers who have spent decades building their own professional lives. A long career is not only about achievement. It is about learning when to push forward, when to adapt, and when to redefine success on your own terms. Phoebe Cates' journey reminds us that managing success, protecting autonomy, and sustaining relevance are not separate challenges. They are part of the same lifelong process of understanding who we are and deciding how we want our work to shape the lives we live. Now we'd love to hear from you. What part of Phoebe Cates' story resonates most with your own experience after decades of work and life changes? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to explore more stories about the hidden lessons behind long and complex careers, stay with us as we continue the journey.